let's move a leg because we're running a bit late and we need to wrap this up as close to schedule as possible. So chances are that all of you thought at least some of the issues that will be discussed in this panel already at least once today. So whether you logged onto an online portal to read the news, well, whatever of the news is not on the possibility of Brexit, or you read them through the old-fashioned way with the aid of an actual newspaper, the topics of unemployment, poverty, income deficiency, and education were likely to have featured very large in what you have read. These topics, in fact, have featured very large, at least a decade or so, particularly large for the last decade or so, during a time that Paul Krugman has referred to as the Great Recession. But in truth, these challenges have been around forever. The Great Depression, Germany's hyperinflation in the 20s, England's 18th and 19th century industrial mills are just some instances and some exemplification of these issues that we will discuss. Most probably, they're not the most notable ones, but many of these instances have existed in the past and will certainly exist in the future as well. An indication of how important these challenges are is the fact that they have many representations in the world of arts and literature. I mean, who amongst us that has read Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath can forget about that book? Munrau's Last Laugh, a film in the 1920s, portrays employment not just as a means to earn a living, but as a very important feature in shaping up one's identity. We have examples later on in the century in film. We have Vittorio De Sica's Bicycle Thieves in 1948, Kurosawa's Tokyo Sonata in 2008. These are films that talk about unemployment, and they all span almost a century. Music, the recently reformed Gang of Four, or the pop group, they sing about unemployment and the perils of not having a job. Pink Floyd's The Wall talks about education and how it influences youth's role and participation in society. Even academia has struggled with these issues forever. Karl Marx, Weber, Keynes, Krugman, Rogoff, they all try to deal with these things one way or another. No particular answer has been agreed on. So it's a little bit too much to hope that this panel will provide this answer. However, we can be certain that this panel will give us the opportunity to really reflect on some of the issues, that the philanthropic sector faces on a daily basis, and on which it needs to delineate quickly and on which it needs to act swiftly. So this is a great opportunity to dwell in these issues a little bit more and possibly theorize on them, because theory is always for someone and for something and for a purpose. So starting with you, Melissa, what is the relationship between inequality and deficits in education, income, and employment? Is there a defining factor?
So I think when you think about this complex of issues, which, as you correctly say, has been something that we have been struggling with across space and time for much of human existence, it's clear that all of these factors are not only causes but symptoms, and that they are completely interrelated. And I guess one way to frame this is not so much to think of this as intractable problems, which suggests that there is very little hope, but that they are more like what the German scholar in the 1960s, Horst Ritter, identified as wicked problems. He was contrasting them with what he called tame problems. And wicked problems, like poverty, inequality, unequal access to education, unequal access to employment, are problems that are difficult to solve, not so much because they're complicated, but because we don't have a broad consensus on exactly what the problem is. Different people will define the problem differently. For some people, what is a cause is for other people a symptom. As a result of that, there's no way to have a broad agreement on what the path forward is. And in fact, there's often no broad agreement on what it will look like when the problem is solved. What does it look like? What would it look like for us to say that we have solved the education problem? Exactly what would that mean? Is it simply literacy? Is it the ability to be a productive part of society? Is it the ability to secure a job that gives you a better living than you would have had otherwise? We don't have broad agreement on the problem, and therefore we don't have such broad agreement on the solutions. So those are wicked problems, and that in many ways is the work of philanthropy.
So, Allan, given that there are all these definitional issues that truly affect the way one can act on addressing these problems, how shall we go about addressing them?
Well, I have the answer.
Great.
I'm going to sell my car and move to Thessalonica. But as you said, these problems have been around for a long time, and Plutarch 2,000 years ago had a go at this very topic in his book on education. And he concluded that the beginning, the middle, and the end of the matter is education, that poverty, inequality, employment, unemployment is a function of whether you have access to education or not. And I think to further sharpen the problem, I think for me it's the problem of access. How do we assure that women and girls have equal access to education? How do we assure that the 75 million young people whose education has been interrupted by these current conflicts all over the world? How do we assure that refugees of the future will have access to education? To me, is the problem, and we can't solve poverty, inequality, or employment without being sure education is there. The problem is public policy is not addressing these problems. There's not a public policy of education for women and girls. There's not a public policy for education to take care of the refugees and the displaced people. And that's where foundations are really stepping up. And I'm noticing it more and more that it's the foundations rather than the governments. It's the private sector rather than the public policy that is taking care of addressing these gaps. And we're lucky to have it.
So I think you mentioned two very important things. One is that you have made an argument on education being the cause of the problem and all the others, unemployment, etc., being the effects. And you also mentioned the role of the state, which somehow is not being fulfilled right now. Let's keep the first one in mind for the rest of the discussion. And the second point you made, I would like to address it to Stefanos. Stefane, what is the role of the welfare state in this? I mean, clearly we have an entity that must get control of the situation and provide what it has to provide, and does it do that?
Of course, we have a welfare mix. Please, could we show the plot, please?
Have prepared a few graphs?
Yes, excellent, excellent. We have a welfare mix: state, market, the third sector, voluntary sector. At Democritus University, we have a research agenda. It emphasizes on poverty and the welfare state effect on poverty rates, on poverty outcomes. So, I won't go into much detail. I would like very much to show you, to make a very short description of some important empirical findings, because, you know, empirical-driven policy making is so important. It's so important in terms of social policy. So let's have a look, please. We have on the vertical the poverty rate, and this analysis is based on welfare clusters, welfare regimes. I embrace the typology of Espen Andersen and other theories like Petmezidou, Papatheodorou, Katrougalos, etc., that have worked on the South European welfare model. Okay, so we have four welfare state types: the social democratic, the conservative, which is refers to the continental countries, the liberal, the Anglo-Saxon countries, and the South European. So you see the pattern. These are poverty rates based on the period 1995-2013, where we have data, empirical data from ECHP and EUC, and we run this longitudinal and comparative analysis. So look at the pattern, please, and we can move to the next one, please. Look at the pattern. No, please, the previous one, please.
This one?
No, this one, yes. Nordic, continental, Anglo-Saxon, South European, the escalation of poverty rates. First pattern. Let's proceed, please.
So now,
and thanks a lot for this.
So we have one more, so let's keep it
short.
Sharp.
Yes, I will keep it really short. So we have an indication that the welfare state plays a significant role in poverty rates, in the variability of cross-national variability in poverty rates. So what have we done here? We have taken the structure of the social transfers, pensions and other social transfers. We have three symbols: the circle, the dash, and the diamond. The circle is poverty rate at the beginning, the initial poverty rate. You see, they are quite similar among the welfare clusters. The dash is after pensions. Take a look at Greece, please. The EL, Hellas. See, the pension effect is huge. But see the rest of the social transfers. We have no other social transfers: housing, family, healthcare, disability, housing, I don't know what else. It's really residual in our country. But there is a pattern here as well. There is a pattern that says that other social transfers, except pensions, account for a large part of the reduction in poverty rates. Okay, the third one.
That's the last one.
This is clear-cut, I think. This is clear-cut. We have a pattern in terms of clustering of countries. Please have a look. Have a look. Up, we have the South European countries. In between, the liberal and the continental. And down, right, the Nordic. And alongside, Netherlands. In our analysis, the Netherlands is in the social democratic welfare regime. And what is important in this? What is important? The R-squared, this number, 0.78, is a huge number in terms of the explanation of the variability of poverty. So my forceful argument is over the necessity of implementing universal social citizenship-based provisions.
So, given that this is the argument, can we safely assume that Allan's point that governments don't actually promote effectively education right now is
I
true?
told you that I will be rather critical. I very much appreciate the work of all of you, very much. I would like to be rather critical towards the concept of human capital that has dominated, okay? And we see the large share of the anti-poverty funds, the lion's share.
But just give me a second. Before we go into human capital, would you agree?
Because you said about education. For me, education is not the solution for everything. Social protection is always a solution.
So the point is, we identified here education as a prime motive for the creation of unemployment, income deficiencies, etc., and we have an argument here that, you know, in your view, the data shows that this might not be necessarily the case. You think there are other causal factors that are at play other than education, correct?
Almost 80%.
Almost 80%.
This says a lot.
So what I get from both points then is that whether it's education that is the prime defining factor of this, or there are other factors as well, that the welfare state should play a big role, but right now we are all experiencing that this role is not adequately fulfilled, for whatever reason. So my next question to Claire is, Claire, given that this is the case, for whatever reason, are there any hybrid systems that could accommodate and fill in the gaps of these potential failures of the welfare state?
Well, I think one of the problems we all have, I mean, in Europe and also in the areas I look at in North Africa and the Middle East, the Levant. So if we're looking primarily at the 20 states which border the Mediterranean, one of the problems is the welfare state is struggling because there isn't enough income coming in. You know, taxation is the source of income to put into welfare services. If you're not generating more businesses, you're not getting more competitive, there are not more active citizens, it's a diminishing returns game to see higher unemployment, and as we know, youth unemployment in Greece, in Spain, to some extent Italy, and to a lesser extent France, is as high, if not higher, than it is in North Africa, which is shocking, really, given the standards of living are actually lower in North Africa. This youth unemployment is predominantly made up of graduates. Certainly that's the case in North Africa, but there are a lot of unemployed graduates of universities. So education is needed, but you also need a system which is more joined up. Now, you're asking about hybrid systems. I think one of the areas we've neglected in policy is what's generally called the third sector. So things like social enterprise, cooperatives, they have been on the rise in recent years. But to me, I know, Melissa, you said we have to agree on the problem. To me, across the region, we're looking at the Mediterranean basin, the key problem is the contraction and crisis of the middle classes. Because unless you have that link between the very poor, and we can move on and talk about inequality, but the wealthy and those who are not only gaining more wealth, but are actually closing the doors behind them in terms of wealth generation, you've got to have a dynamic middle class, and that's how you employ the unemployed graduates. Through things like social enterprise, through things like SME development. I'm struck by the number of training programs I've been involved in, particularly in North Africa, where the trainers and the funders go so far to train people, educate them in new skills, whether it's the Young Arab Voices program I was involved in, or the young, we've actually got a member here from the Young Arab Panelists Network International, getting people to think on the ground, younger people, so in the 25 to 35 age group, how they can influence policy so that money is put in intelligent places to support good ideas. What we don't do, whether it's within countries or funders from outside, is open the doors where we can with senior policymakers, with the elites, I'll call them the gatekeepers, who are not, for all sorts of reasons we can go into, in the least bit interested in allowing new actors in to what is a limited cake, which may in future years be shrinking. And all I would say is I think a role for philanthropy in this lies in its convening power, in the fact that it can network across the very smallest actor to the most senior and actually find out who is ready to understand what I call I'll finish on this, their Lampedusa moment. Now, this is the Count Lampedusa, not the island. If anyone has read, it's my favorite book in Italian, Il Gattopardo, The Leopard, where the Count of Lampedusa famously said, as he saw this is in the 19th century, he saw Garibaldi's forces moving on Sicily, where he was an impoverished count, and basically said, everything has to change in order for things to remain the same. Those of us who have access to senior policymakers, politicians, those involved in the key economic, in the sort of big businesses and international networks, we have to persuade those people that they have to open the gate a bit for more growth, to allow more people in, particularly this younger generation who are at the moment across the region. I mean, I see it very much in North Africa, but it's happening here too. People are not being allowed in, and this is a generation that has very good ideas. SMEs, we've talked about non-stop for the last 5 years. They're failing because the regulatory framework isn't there, the credit isn't accessible, there's corruption all over the place. They are being blocked. We need those doors to open. We need to persuade people the cake gets bigger, that other people have a slice of the cake in order for them to protect their own cake, or their piece of the cake, because history tells us if they just close down the hatches, eventually what we saw in 2011 across the region will happen again. It's inevitable.
So, Claire, you talk about the importance of the welfare state. You identify some failures that are in existence, irrespectively of the reasons behind them many times. And you elaborated on the complexity of the situation, the different actors and how they might collaborate with each other. My question to you, Karima, stems from an address you did to the African Trade Forum a few years ago. You said in the African Trade Forum that the role of a government in a planned economy is much easier than the role of the government in a market economy. In the planned economy, it might not work, but they know what to do. In a market economy, things are more complicated. I wonder how you see the possibility of the government having a successful role in partnership with all the other sectors, given the complicated picture that Claire communicated to us.
Yes, in a controlled economy, the government has more control and they can put policy, whatever they want. Not necessarily this is the best policy, but that's it. Although with uncontrolled economy, with the market economy and so, the government doesn't have this. But let me tell you, and this may be new information to you too, what has made me say that. It was an African conference, as you said, and it was international, and it was put because of trying to prove that, or trying to find a way to overcome poverty in Africa. You know, in Africa, it is the highest poverty all over the world. And they took the UN took the strategy of trying to beat poverty with trade. And they invited people, you know, businessmen, so from all over the European and American countries and the African countries. And I was invited as a consultant to open and lead discussion and to explain the relation between poverty and international trade. And as I have discovered, well, whatever you do, I mean, reading and trying to write, they are things in actual life which you cannot tell, you know, until you are faced with it. This was the fact that, you know, in the first session, I was opening the relation between the two, and we have to improve trade in Africa and so on. And in the lunchtime, I found some businessmen and women coming to my table and saying, we want to tell you something which they could not say in the hall. This was the following, that, you know, in Africa, there are two countries, there are supposedly countries beside each other. Because of the controlled economy and the government rules they put, they are not allowed to trade between them. And so if they want commodity A from the country is a neighbor country, they cannot get it.
So my question on this is, if governments have proven to be so difficult to work on that level, will they be proven to be more successful in working in more complicated environments together with the third sector or the private sector in order to promote welfare state objectives?
Panos, I am telling you, and then I'll come to the conclusion, something which I have learned as an economist. You know, this country, they have to export the commodity to one of the European countries or Middle East countries, and the other countries, which they are poor, they have to import it from them, the same commodity to them, which means a lot of money have the consumer to pay for the commodity which he can get much cheaper, you know. And so why is that? Because the government is under control, and there are conflicts between, and this happens in many African countries, you know. And I wonder whether in other developing countries or not. But here I'm saying that when you say the government, yes, they can control it, and they have to overcome these burdens, but they don't do it because of politics, you know. And that's why I'm saying, yes, the government has said you have to part of it, because the end of the session, at the last sessions, I have attacked the governments in the African government, and I have attacked the international organizations because they have to put pressure on those governments just to release the policies, is to make people less poor by allowing it.
So would you be optimistic or pessimistic on the prospect of governments working within a state with other sectors of the non-profit or for-profit sector in trying to promote things like education, better income distribution, etc.? Do you think this has a good potential, or do you think it's something that we will not see happening?
Well, they look at it from their own view, which is not necessarily, but most of the time I see it's not the optimal view.
Okay.
And if you find that when I say the international organization, because they can put pressure in certain ways by, you know, just the subsidy they give, the help they give, in order to make them look at it, because there are policies which the international organization put pressure on it, which is wrong for the country, because country A has its special conditions, country B has its special conditions, etc.
So, Allan, we have a view here that, you know, the welfare state, very important, many different aspects to the goods it can promote, with differences of opinion on the causality of those aspects. A very complicated environment, as Claire identified it, and a rather pessimistic view on the ability of a government to deliver on these hybrid system partnerships. What is your view on the ability of the other members of that hybrid system partnership to deliver, namely the third sector? Is the third sector equipped to complement the state rather than substitute it in some cases? And will the third sector support welfare state initiatives without crowding out other different causes like volunteerism or private or state investment?
Well, when you look at the charts, you wish there were more welfare states, given the reduction of poverty that seems to happen. And I think the private sector and philanthropy is really stepping up in a major way, unprecedented way. It didn't happen really much in the 20th century, to replace or to do things we all wish the state would do to address unemployment, poverty, inequality. I see it often through education, because the big bets philanthropy is making are giving women and girls access, working on access for people with disabilities, creating educational systems in parallel where the state has failed. Foundations are educating out-of-school children because the state's 59 million out-of-school children, because states are unable to deal with out-of-school children. So I think the reality of this century is that the welfare state is probably here, and it's being financed by philanthropy.
Stefane, I see you smile over there. Your thoughts?
Allan is an expert on education. Okay. I told you I have a critical approach over education, and by considering education the human capital of individuals, okay, as the most important determinant of our welfare, we tend to ignore other parameters. And do you mind if we show the equation now?
Yes, we have an equation that solves the problem of the welfare state. It always helps to talk with equations.
I know it may look complicated, but
it's the next one.
Okay.
Now that's an equation I understand.
That's the equation.
You know, that's why I wanted you to assist.
Walk us through it.
This is the human capital theory equation. Okay, it's simply put, our welfare depends on the parental investment in our education, okay, and other parameters that determine this relationship are the individual traits, eta, plus the random component in life, luck. Okay, but the most crucial...
How big is luck? How big is luck? How much percentage?
Well, the other parameters explain approximately half of the involved mechanisms. Okay? Almost half. So we don't know the other half. It's called the black box, actually. We don't know the other half. The welfare state plays a crucial role. But since you cannot link macro-level variables with micro-level variables, it's not easy to estimate the welfare state effect directly.
Okay, so my question is this then. I mean, here we have a way to quantify things, and I'm sure many people will disagree on the basic methodology of that, but it is a methodology. I mean, it's specific. And apart from education, there are other aspects to inequality in a society that the third sector tries to address. A very easy one is, well, not an easy one, a very blatant one is healthcare, right? So you might get health-related conclusions out of this equation, but the fact remains that when you go to a hospital during an economic crisis, you see deficiencies. And these deficiencies, for one reason or another, cannot be filled up by the welfare state. What does the third sector do there? Do they intervene or do they not? Do they not because they are seen as substituting the state, or do they complement?
Proactively or reactively? This is the main essence of social policy today. Should the welfare state act reactively or proactively or reactively? Now the emphasis is on the proactive fashion. Okay, we invest in the human capital of children, of individuals, so that they can become employable, they can insert themselves in the flexible labor market, and so on and so forth. Okay, but what I want to say about this equation here, it brings welfare state retrenchment.
It brings?
Welfare state retrenchment.
Retrenchment?
Because the emphasis is placed on human capital. Becker and Toms, what did they say? We should invest in human capital by direct public investments in education. and let's constrain all the other fields of social policy, because what matters is human capital, education. Newer assessments, Allan, show that the education per se cannot explain much of the variability of poverty. Inequality, take whatever indicator you want. And the second parameter is that it doesn't explain much of your achievements in your working career anymore.
But here I have the following question, and Melissa, I'll get to you with a follow-up after the question for Claire, because I think it will set up the discussion about social investment very well. Claire, there was a paper by Chatham House not a while ago, very recently, where you researched the expectations of youth around the Mediterranean basin, and you found very similar expectations from all the youth. How would that finding fit with, you know, Stefanos' elaboration on the role of the welfare state and everything?
It depends. Don't forget, I come from the Anglo-Saxon models, which I was horrified to see seem to be failing completely on poverty alleviation, because we're actually told that absolute poverty has gone down in the UK. But on this specific question, what's really striking is, don't forget, we come from, well, I work in a policy environment where we're looking at the geopolitics, and in discussions about this area, particularly North Africa, we're absolutely fixated by the spread of radicalization, by ISIS, by the fear, which comes very much from the north to the south, that young unemployed people means people vulnerable to being picked up by terrorist organizations and criminal networks as well. And in doing this, it was interviewing people from Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, Egypt and Jordan, who are all involved in this program I mentioned, Young Arab Voices, which they've signed up to. Amazingly, it's a debate club to learn the critical thinking skills, which apparently they don't get in school, of debating. So they have to argue from points of view that they don't necessarily hold themselves. So we had a debate on, has the Arab Spring been a success, or has it been a failure? And regardless of their own opinions, they had to put together the arguments that defended either side. This, to my surprise, because I thought it's debate clubs are the sort of things we do at Oxford University and universities in the UK, has proved to be a huge success. It's like a light bulb going off. They are applying these skills to thinking outside their own environments and joining up the dots for themselves in the environment they're working in. And when we interviewed them and said, what really matters to you? They were extraordinarily dismissive of the discourse about radicalization. They said, you know, the vast majority of people are not interested, have no intention of radicalizing themselves or being radicalized. What we want is a job, a life, a career, to travel, to move around the region, to be allowed out, to have visas to Europe so that we can study or work, then come back and apply the skills that we've learned to our own economies, pick up new ideas, which they're already doing online, by the way. We seriously underestimate a generation which is logged in laterally as well as vertically all over the place. They can find things out, particularly those who suddenly realize what critical thinking means in terms of evaluating the truth or merits of various things they're finding. And everything they said about massive unemployment, about being excluded, about not being listened to, about there not being space for young people to express themselves, about there being no appreciation that if you do want to find out about who's being radicalized, the ones who are not being radicalized know what's happening in their peer group. No one asked them. Youth policies are made without any consultation at all of the youth who are concerned. And it seems to me this is also happening increasingly in Europe. If you look at the protest movements, the new parties, we're just ahead of the next stage of elections, or rather re-elections in Spain, because there are new parties, Podemos, Ciudadanos, who have risen out of the events in the Arab world in 2011 to say our political classes no longer represent us, they're corrupt, we want something else, we want something more participatory. So just to link it briefly with the model, you said 50% is luck. We live in the Mediterranean. 50%, or at least some of that 50%, is who you know. It's what the Arabs called wasta. Yes, you know, luck does not play a role in a system or systems which are losing sight of meritocracy. There was a period, can I just finish a sentence? There was a period in which if you did well, certainly where I come from, you did well at school, you got good results, you would have the same chance, pretty much, as anyone else to get a job. Now, systems are such, including in the UK, whereas if you don't come from a privileged moneyed family, even at Chatham House, we have internships. They are privileged. Despite all the efforts we make to bring people in from further afield, if you don't live near London, you haven't got somewhere to live for free. We pay for the transport to get to Chatham House and food, and people, it's limited to 3 months, so we're not prejudicing people who would otherwise be employed, and we tend to take on students whose internship at Chatham House enables them to get better jobs later. But we have systems throughout Europe, and particularly I would say in the Mediterranean, where it's the Worcester system. It's who you know, whether you have parents, family, connections who can help you get a job, help you get that funding line to start up your business. This is something we're not addressing. It's not luck. We have to cut back and find ways of opening these doors I mentioned earlier to allow more people in on merit, because they have a good idea, because they followed a good education, because they are willing to contribute to society. And the more money you generate, the more you're going to be able to have these hybrid systems in which the expectations we all have of the welfare state, looking after us, as we say in Britain, from the cradle to the grave. The health service is entirely free, but it's cracking. You have to have bits of the system which will pick up the slack through social enterprise, which is a way of, for example, setting up homes for the elderly on a for-profit basis, but actually provides a social good, and there's a number of those happening throughout the Mediterranean.
So thank you for this insight and for the candid answer. So, Melissa,
Yes.
is then the discussion on the role of philanthropic institutions and the third sector one according to which the third sector is there to promote equal opportunity and options that people don't have?
Yeah. I think in the current environment, there are two sort of massive opportunities for philanthropy, and they're very disparate. One opportunity has to do with the 50% that's in the black box, some of which, as Claire has indicated, has to do with basic issues having to do with rights, opportunity, and access. If philanthropy does not continue to shed a light on that, we are really only playing with half a deck of cards rather than the whole deck. So that's one end of it. The other is that the reality also is, as many people have already noted, the welfare state has done tremendous things in terms of transfer of funds from one part of the economy to another, but it's not going to be sufficient, and in many places in the world it's already insufficient, without a better relationship with private sector actors and new ways to think about using financial models and tools. We will not even be able to work with the 50% that lives outside the black box very successfully. And that's the field that you were mentioning earlier of social finance, which is, in one way of looking at it, part of philanthropy. If philanthropy is the voluntary use of private resources for public good, that doesn't necessarily restrict itself to donations. That can also mean the role of philanthropy in enabling social investment or income or impact investing, which is opportunities to use capital to get some kind of a financial return while also getting a carefully documented social and environmental return. And those investments may be above market, at market, below market, but they are a way of harnessing a level of capital that is far beyond the amount of money that philanthropy can simply donate. And those opportunities are going to be very important for us to have a sort of way of working with the private sector, the public sector, and the third sector going forward. We need to use those tools, we need to understand them better, and we need to unleash that kind of capital potential.
So would you say that in the context of the positive externality of future economic development, of all the things that you described, the role of the third sector is or not the whole of the third sector, the role of foundations in the third sector is to help governments and the private sector take on more risk than they would be willing or that they could take, or is it something deeper than that?
So philanthropy, especially an endowed foundation, is in a unique position to take a kind of risk that is difficult for the public sector to take, although the mayor of Thessaloniki seems quite prepared to take quite a lot of risk, and that the private sector is often reluctant to take when they don't see how a return can be generated. So social enterprise is one route to that, but there's also a whole wealth of innovations developing in the field of, for example, financial inclusion. And that includes not just access to microcredit, which doesn't create very much in the way of assets, but micro savings, micro insurance, opportunities for online learning, for things like fintech. All of these kinds of things are currently being experimented with on a trial basis with support from the philanthropic sector as well as the corporate sector. And if these models are successful, and one of the initiatives that we've been involved in was an online course to train people from 20 developing countries in fintech, had an 87% graduation rate. That was just last month. We'll see what that turns to in terms of employment, and from that, what does it turn into access to financial instruments for people at the bottom of the pyramid. Philanthropy can kind of road test and develop proof of concept for some of these kinds of ideas that can then be taken to scale either by the state or by the private sector.
Are the new philanthropists interested in these topics as opposed to curing disease?
Many new philanthropists are. I think that everybody who comes into philanthropy new tends to want to start off with something that's tactical, and so there's a sense of comfort in building schools, in funding medical research, because we all understand what that is. But the more time people spend, and the more they realize that these are not tame problems but wicked problems, the more they realize that they have to look at new tools and new ideas.
Karima, do you think these innovative solutions that they try to provide a proof of concept that may or may not work at a greater scale are applicable in the Mediterranean? I mean, they seem to be working in certain parts of the world very well up to now. Can we apply them here?
Yeah, I didn't concentrate well because I don't feel well about what she's suggesting of.
Well, the suggestion was that there are initiatives of microcredit or providing financial hybrid solutions to people who are disadvantaged in society through philanthropic foundations. And these are used in the United States context, at least, rather successfully so far. Is this something that can be applied in the Mediterranean context, or is it science fiction for us?
No, it depends on your starting point. Because if you have, illiteracy is high, and you have even with education, you don't get really talent, Therefore, microfinances cannot be as successful as it is supposed to be. They got microfinances, and then they close the project, and some of them are even, they are thrown in the prison, and I know that on facts, because also I worked consultant for some of those philanthropies even give microfinance. I say it doesn't work. Yeah. Therefore, it depends what are the conditions of the country, and that's why I think it's very wrong that, as we say to the international organization, to have the same solution for everyone. No, this applies to the developed countries, maybe because there are the different setup are different, but not for us. It's the same with poverty and income distribution, etc. There are things which you have to look at the country itself and then try to see the best policy for it, Yeah.
Claire, do you have a similar experience from such initiatives in the places that you have studied, or have a different view?
Well, I was just going to agree with Karima that, you know, the two strap lines, if you like, I hold in my head since the uprisings in protest movements of 2011 is, number one, the devil is in the detail. And that's basically, we cannot apply the same things, you know, that every country, one of the things that's happened since, I'll call it the Arab Spring for the sake of brevity, but everything that's happened in the region demonstrates how what looked like very similar autocratic systems have now changed into very different things. So some have reverted back to worse than before 2011, others have progressed, and you actually have to look very closely at what is going on in each country and seek out. I think too often, and I see this a lot in European policy towards North Africa, the whole Euro-Mediterranean structures, devise grand framework plans, but they fall flat when it comes to the implementation. And I think it's one of the roles I would see for philanthropy is not just piloting, and I totally agree, good ideas, but actually joining up the dots, making sure that the people who are stopping things happening make them happen, incentivize them, cajole them, persuade them, convene meetings where everybody gets to know each other so that from top to bottom, nobody's feeling threatened. I think one of the reasons there is this blockage of the younger generation is obviously an older generation who are not as linked in as the younger people are afraid of, they have vested interests, they're afraid of what follows next. They've already had a sense of the instability of the region, so they're all clamping down. For others, it's political reasons, you know, it's all about linking the economy to politics, etc. So the other strapline I've had in mind is follow the money, because it's a myth to say there is no money around the Mediterranean. And we have to focus more on unleashing those pots of money. For example, in Tunisia, Tunisians with money are not investing in Tunisia. The Tunisian government is increasingly appealing to the outside world to fund infrastructure projects they need to link the coast to the interior of Tunisia. But what does it take to mobilize the money within Tunisia? Because it's the biggest incentive to others, that if you're investing in your own society, others will follow. But until you do, so it's breaking those chains, because there's big money in the region, but look where it's going. It's going, certainly in the case of Egypt, and there's a lot of Gulf money being put into Egypt to secure the Egyptian system as it is. How much of that money, I mean, there was $20 billion was put into the banking system. How much of that money is going into creating youth employment? How much of it's going into big infrastructure projects, which may be needed, but it's still not trickling down in the old vocabulary, to creating jobs for a very, very squeezed middle class? The majority of the middle class in Egypt still want to and work for the state. So breaking out of those models is not something one individual philanthropy can do, but actually challenging the received wisdoms and finding allies, those I call of the Lampedusa moment, those who've understood there is going to be a round two of the Arab Spring, or whatever you want to call it, and there'll certainly be protests here and elsewhere unless the system gives. It allows more people in, it allows good ideas to flourish, and the detail side of this is you have to look at the regulatory framework, the enablers, why it's being blocked. I know, and just to finish, a very ambitious young entrepreneur in Morocco, and Morocco is supposed to be one of the better environments to do this, who says SMEs fail because they can't get access to credit. The credit goes to people who know people who know people. The system is corrupt. You have to spend your whole time getting rubber stamps to actually continue operating. And there's a big, we haven't talked about, informal sector. Around 40% of the Moroccan economy is completely outside the welfare state. I mean, it's, you know, the parallel economy. And the third thing is, even though you're doing a good business, you have a good business plan, your clients don't pay. So you need small claims courts. And if you go bankrupt after all this, it's a criminal offense. So we should decriminalize bankruptcy, create an environment in which to fail at least once is part of your long-term plan, because that's how it works elsewhere. And those who can, I keep saying we, I'm very critical of these discussions that say, we need to do these, we need to do that. One of the roles of philanthropy in convening is to identify who is going to do it, who wants to do it, who can be persuaded to do it, who has the ability to open doors, who has the ability to put the pilot schemes that look good. These financial models have to be inserted in context with people who are incentivized to do it and which are sustainable. And you only do that by changing mindsets, attitudes, and at the moment the attitudes are very much security-based, very much retrenched. This is a much bigger problem than I'm describing, but particularly in Egypt, the shutters have gone down.
So Stefane, I mean, here we have an implicit answer to your question on whether philanthropy should step in proactively or reactively. Here we have a very clear proposal that philanthropy should step in proactively in instigating structural change. Very small on the one hand, but very impactful possibly on the other. What's your take on that?
First of all, let me say something that Claire mentioned earlier. It's about the South European societies. I know South European societies have these family key networks that rely extensively on, and the concept of clientelism, which is very crucial in our case. But coming to your question now, voluntary sector is not my area of study and research and so on. I know a few things about the third sector and philanthropies, but the important element is that, in my view, let's take the Reagan administration. We made a discussion earlier about the Reagan administration and how the voluntary sector was used in order to curtail social spending. We have to bear this in mind, that the third sector serves a lot to the society, but it can be the vehicle through which welfare state retrenchment can take place. So maybe I'm not expressing it in the correct manner. I'm trying to elucidate my point as the best I can. So I'm in favor of the welfare state. I think it's not a secret anymore. I'm in favor of the welfare state, and I'm in favor of empirical data. Why? Why? Because they allow us to depict in the best way our social reality. Okay, our social reality is best depicted by our empirical data. What we have at hand, we can analyze it and draw some conclusions. I'm sorry, I didn't answer quite well your question.
You answered perfectly, and it it gives me a very good lead to ask Melissa. I mean, I can't remember whether it was George Orwell or Hayek that said that the road to serfdom is paved with good intentions. I mean, what Stefanos says is that foundations try to do well, but by doing well, they nest a grave danger for society.
Sure.
Well, what's your take on that?
I think that's absolutely accurate. I don't want to be too political, but I think that many governments have used as an excuse for retrenchment the concept that the third sector is going to be able to step into their role. And I think that they are often being very disingenuous because they know very well that the size of the third sector is orders of magnitude smaller than the resources of the public sector. So by itself, philanthropy in the charitable sector cannot be a substitute on a one-for-one basis for what it is that the state can do. The philanthropic sector is much, much smaller than, and will always be much, much smaller than the private sector or the public sector. In the U.S., for example, the Gates Foundation plays a very significant role in funding education policy, et cetera. The entire annual budget of the Gates Foundation for its education philanthropy is the equivalent of 1 week of the budget of the New York City public school system. So philanthropy is not going to be able by itself to substitute for the welfare state. And I don't think philanthropic leaders see themselves coming in and doing that because they recognize the arithmetic is not going to work. On the other hand, when we look at the recently enacted SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals that all of the member countries of the UN agreed upon last September, I believe that the annual cost to achieve these goals by 2030 is in the neighborhood of 45 trillion a year. I'm not exactly sure what that means. But that kind of funding is not currently available in the philanthropic sector or in the public sector. So we have to figure out new ways to harness money to make change happen. That's all I would say. And it is absolutely true that it has to be appropriate culturally and developmentally for every country and place. But we need new ways to make money make change happen.
So last question for the panel before we open it up for a discussion, and it's a question for both Karima and Allan. I'll pose it to both of you in turns. So let's say you sit in the board of a foundation and you have a finite amount of money, and you have to choose to fund either one of the two. Fund direct employment opportunities for people that are young and unemployed, or fund development of skills for these people without directly funding their employment opportunities. Which one of the two would you go? It's either black or white. It's easier than in real life.
I think it is the same, because if you have many illiterates and and when I say illiterates, this does not mean that they don't read and write only, no. But there are also culturally illiterates. I mean, they go to the university and in Egypt, they study things which they cannot have them in employment, Therefore, I think the same goes together, That is, you train them, or just when you say employment, how would you create employment? Unless you give them funds. And I'm telling you, there are quite a few, they cannot pay the debt if they don't have the skills, and you don't give them the technical support. That's a problem. Because, okay, I can give small funds, but the most important thing, I'll give them technical support. It's not what they do in Egypt, for example, they help them in marketing their product. This is not the number one. Number one, the skill itself, because when they come to a new project, they don't have much skill. And they say, okay, you have made already, you provide the, this, I forgot the name, the primary study that you can do it by that and that. This is not enough, because you go to any office and they do it for you, but you yourself, when you open your project, cannot do anything. Therefore, when you say what to be done, it's not only its skills, try to upgrade their skills, it's this get employment, but even when you give them employment and give them funds, you have to be after them until you'll be sure they stand there on their own. But the way it is done, it's not good. And when you say employment also, because we have, and that's important to mention, the productivity of the labor. The productivity of the labor is really low. And for example, in the public sector in Egypt, you have to employ people, although their productivity is very low. And this is quite a cost for you, and you make losses, Therefore, even if you give them low wages, this does not work. I have made some calculations regarding, it was a study on Germany and Egypt. Germany, they pay much higher wages than Egypt. But what we care for is the productivity. I mean, do the labor, take a certain wage, just make profits, make productivity which brings profits and so. And the study ended up that labor in Egypt is more expensive than in Germany, given the productivity of it, Therefore, we shouldn't be really, believe to numbers, We have to do whatever is really right.
So, Allan, because I think you would rather kind of agree with this answer, I'll make it a little bit more complicated. Let's say you focus this dilemma in the context of 55% youth unemployment. So clearly you have economic conditions that are overwhelmingly bad. So do you invest on people's skill developments and education, or do you try to make some sort of arrangement with government or the private sector and create employment opportunities? I mean, how much can you beat a dead horse when it's dead?
For me, it's very clear I would invest in employment, because I don't think 19th century education institutions know how to train people for jobs in the 21st century. And in our own country, if you gave me that choice, I would expand our army. Not because I want to send the army anywhere, but it's the only thing that trains illegal immigrants, gives them a path to citizenship. We have 11 million of them. We have our own refugee problem we need to solve with employment. It teaches them skills, it teaches them ethics, it teaches them some values. I would never want to use the army, and I wish there were an alternative to it, but we need to put people to work. And I think that's something all of our societies urgently need. And education is not training people for employment, and that's the problem.
It's a great turnaround in the discussion with the person who started arguing that education is at the core of everything, would actually advocate employment opportunities at the expense of education. That's how interesting these topics are. So let's open up the discussion to the floor. Please try to be very brief so that we can make up a little bit of the time. I see a hand over there. Yes? Well, since you're sitting next to each other, can we take both questions at the same time? And please, I would ask you again to be brief.
I have a different question, I'm sure. I'm Petros Lalangas from the International Society of Naval Architects and Marine Engineers. I have a question for Mr. Papanastasiou. I found your graphs very interesting. However, I noticed you have not included Germany in your chart.
DE. Deutschland, DE, Deutschland. It was there.
Deutschland?
Yeah.
Oh, you had it as a D. I was expecting you to see it with a G.
Okay.
because
I use the notation, the Eurostat notation, so that's why.
I see, because as we all know, they are the big financial winners in the European Union. So they are very low on the chart. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The gentleman next to you.
Thank you very much for the panel and for the organizers. My name is Goodman. I'm professor at Cairo University. I actually would like to invite everybody to think more fundamentally about the issues. We talk about inequality, poverty, and unemployment, and these are issues that basically relate to the youth. So it's a youth problem par excellence. And I don't think education is the answer, as Alan Goodman mentioned, because education is a public good. With this tendency to move towards a market economy, there is going to be plenty of problems down the line. And I think we better rethink the social and economic policies to start with. I'm not against the market economy. For I'm saying that, Alan Goodman said to the answer is education. I challenge this on two grounds. One, education is a victim in a market economy environment. Number two, highly educated people in the southern Mediterranean and also in this country are unemployed. So it seems that education is not, it is important, but it's not the answer here. And my call is for us to rethink public policies in this vital area. Thank you very much.
So Claire, the question is, should we think these issues more in a more iconoclastic basis than the one that we have been discussing?
Well, I think we've got to address really the scale of the problem. I mean, just looking at Egypt alone, just to stay still, I understand 500,000 jobs. Or is it more than that? 500,000 jobs a year have to be created just to stay still. This is for the new entrants to the market. And you're not going to do that by focusing on government policy and what governments can do. This is not the way, if you're in favour of liberal markets, there are different ways of running capitalism which could accommodate the social needs of Egypt or other societies through things like social enterprise, which involve a for-profit motive but reinvest the profits into society, unlike the shareholder takes all model of capitalism, which is a few people who obviously have invested in the company in the first place retain the profits. So I think we do need to think outside the economic box, not by thinking in zero-sum games that we need to go back to socialist models where everything is managed by the state, because our populations are getting too big and too diverse to do that, and the demand for jobs is too quick. But there are, and I'm not saying the third sector is a quick fix either. I mean, there are other models out there we could go into, promoted by the OECD, for example, which is to link Mediterranean societies, particularly North Africa, into longer value chains. So we see evidence of this, not just multinationals, but for example, the Renault car plants in Morocco has involved outsourcing the manufacture of cars in Morocco, but it also is a way of transferring skills. So I think your question about should you pay for employment or education, actually educating people in skills on the job being part of the new model. You know, that employers and investors should actually take more of the burden for vocational training. So it's not just the state that pays for it, but actually those companies and organizations that benefit from it. So there are several models, I could go into more, but the transfer of skills is a very important side of this. Thinking outside rather linear models that liberal capitalism has to be, as we've seen from the chart, just the Anglo-Saxon version, as opposed to a more social democratic model, which could be more adaptable to Mediterranean societies.
Thank you. A question over there, and I think there was a hand over there. You realize why we're saying rock stars wear sunglasses. It's not because they're cool, it's because they can't see from the lights in interviews. So I think there was a hand down there. So Stelios, and then, Mrs. Linou over there.
Yes, thank you to all the panelists. Two questions, one for Claire, the other one for Melissa. Claire, I'm glad we talked about merit. And I wanted to ask you, it seems to me that we look at these things with John Rawls' glasses on, that everything that matters is equality of opportunity.
Yes.
And that does not seem to work right now. And I wanted to ask whether or not we should start considering more seriously equality of outcome. That's the question to you. The one for Melissa is, you spoke about the inability of foundations in terms of monetary or financial means to solve everything. But you do know, because you're very experienced, that it's not only about money.
Right.
The influence that foundations have, it's much more subtle.
Correct.
And it seems to me that in many times we take a rather messianic approach, that is like the approach that the way we look at science, it can solve everything. So we look at the way we can address problems and the solutions we can provide and our policy influence in a rather hubristic way, that we can do everything. We have all the answers. We can step in every situation, provide solutions, walk away, irrelevant of money.
Yeah.
You have thought about these things, so what is your view about this?
Sure.
First, Melissa.
You want to start with me? Okay. I agree with the points that you're making both explicitly and implicitly. Private philanthropy is about far more than its financial resources. A foundation is more than a cash machine, and a private philanthropist is also more than a writer of checks. Philanthropy has, as many of the panelists here have pointed out already, a unique capacity to highlight an issue, to bring stakeholders together, and to ask the questions that are difficult to ask in other contexts, especially the kinds of questions about wicked problems. To what extent are there issues of bias that prevent economic mobility, for example? So all of those are extremely important roles for private philanthropy. I do also think that in the current context, private philanthropy has a unique opportunity to play a different kind of linking role between the public sector and the private sector, because philanthropy kind of sits in this space in between. So I think all of those things are good. I think that foundations need to be more thoughtful about what their role is as institutions and not simply as providers of funds. And the power of foundations as institutions is something that needs a lot more exploration and attention in order for foundations to achieve the potential they have for being part of a solution to some of the wicked problems we confront.
Okay, just briefly, you've asked me about equality of outcome. I've been sitting here wondering what that looks like, because I think societies are inherently unequal. But what we could actually target is at least a minimum standard of living for everybody. So access is critical to healthcare, to the ability to education, to the ability for self-realization is essentially the social goal. What then happens, whether people use the skills they've got, whether they abuse their health, etc., is their affair, and that's why you end up with unequal societies. And I know in Europe, following on the Swiss referendum a week or so ago on there being a kind of universal tax credit that ensures every family, every individual in the country has a minimum income that the government hands out, whatever the going rate is. It was interesting, the Swiss rejected that for fear that it would encourage more inward migration, refugees, migrant workers actually trying to themselves benefit from this. But it has stimulated a bit of a discussion about the efficient distribution of resources. And if you do make sure that people are not on the absolute poverty line, that they do have the wherewithal, the springboard of life, if you like. So education, access to health, access to the workplace, I would argue, which is more meritocratic. I know that's a sort of equality of inputs rather than outputs argument. But if you give people those chances and that assurance, then it seems to me that the welfare state is doing its job. I think sometimes some of the arguments about the welfare state go further down the line, you know, sort of palliative care for people who are not taking responsibility for themselves. And I'm sorry to say, whatever system you think we live in, we do live in a globalized model which is based on capitalism. You can make capitalism have a softer face, you can regulate, you can equalize those things. But you also have to look ahead for people who are not going to seize the opportunities and say, well, at least the basics of life, education, healthcare, some kind of pension are all in place. And that's to do with the nitty-gritty of workplace legislation, etc. And where that line lies is the source of endless political debate in all our societies.
Excuse me, I want to add brief things, you know, because a welfare state, I mean, if it succeeds to reduce poverty, reduce it, I'm not saying eliminating it today, it will be, the burden will be much less tomorrow. Why? Because a family, usually the poor families have larger children, but say a family with 4 or 5 children today, and they are poor, you know, they are not educated, they are not educated, and so on. Those 4 or 5, now we were 7, the parents and 5 children. Tomorrow, next year, there will be 5 poor families with 5, which means 25, which what has been called the poverty multiplier. I mean, one family, if you succeed to erase poverty, from one family you're succeeding it from about, you know, to one family with 5, 6 children for 20 persons tomorrow.
So let's take 2 questions. It's Mrs. Linou at the back and the gentleman here at the front. And let's address them at the same time. Can you please go ahead with your question until Mrs. Linou gets a microphone? Thank you.
Communism failed a few years back because the top apparatchiks were stealing the money and the people were all impoverished, basically. So communism failed. Capitalism is failing because although it's a great system of creating capital, doesn't know how to distribute equitably that capital. So capitalism is failing. We see what is happening with the big chasm, you know, the rich and the poor, so it's not enough money to really go around and make everybody happy. So would the third sector, as you said, combine, of course, with the help of the second and first sector, eventually help incubate cooperatives, so we will go into a cooperative capitalism, which is the fairest way of creating capital because of how cooperatives are structured.
Right.
Mrs. Linou?
Good point.
Yeah, I only wanted to defend the issue of health inequalities, not seeing health inequalities just as inequalities to access to health, but more as inequalities in health determinants, social determinants of health, and how these can interact and be either key factors of causing unemployment or reduction at the educational level, or how the education and unemployment can affect can be the key social determinants of health. So how would you see that?
That's me.
Stephanie, would you like to take the last question, and then we'll go to the formal question and close the session?
Is it possible to hear it again, because I didn't hear it?
Also, it was not clear.
Can you speak up, please, because I didn't hear it.
What I was saying is that the key issue in health today is not access to health services, which remains important, but how you modify social determinants of health. Because it's very well known that the uneducated, even within the same society, might have 10 years less survival than the educated. Or the unemployed equally might have a reduced survival just by the fact that they're unemployment, and the same goes for poverty. So what is the role of the third sector, of the philanthropy, to influence the social determinants of health and not health services per se?
So you want to focus on health, okay?
And I asked you to answer this because your answer, I thought, would be none.
Okay, it's no problem. If someone else would like to answer.
No, I'm joking, go ahead.
It's okay. Anyway, you're asking me about the causal mechanisms. Okay, is it, first of all, we have to identify some basic causal mechanisms. Education, employment, what else, social capital, connectedness, social connectedness, whatever, I don't know. What determines health outcomes? Is that your main question?
The question is that people with different backgrounds in education and income seem to have a much lower life expectancy. And what could be the role of the third sector in improving this situation, given that the welfare state seems not to have succeeded in improving it?
Send women
it depends
and
on
girls
the words. Sorry, Allan?
Send women and girls to school.
It depends on the words of welfare. I mean, if you take the Nordic example, you see a high-quality healthcare system. People enjoy it, okay? On the contrary, if we take the example of the South European societies, we see that the healthcare system is fragmented and it's not well organized. It was never well organized from its very beginning. I believe that the third sector, the voluntary sector, in terms of healthcare, it has played a crucial role. If we manage to find a balance between the state and the market and the service sector, then the third sector, this is really crucial. And I believe it's an area, a field where the voluntary sector has to play a major role.
Okay. Claire, please, very quickly, on the cooperative systems in capitalism.
Absolutely. What, in capitalism? I was just going to say on the welfare issue, Panos and I have just been at a conference looking at, well, it was an international public sector reform conference where the session on the possibilities of digitization of the delivery of services being absolutely targeted to the specific needs of the individual. So we're moving away, that was a big debate, wasn't it? And being interactive as well. So we're moving from a system where welfare is offered, you know, the same thing is offered from the system to whoever wants to take it, to being very specific to the end user and the needs of those end users. We haven't got there yet, but I think that's the next stage of making more efficient use of public resources. As for capitalism, I already said there is more than one way to do capitalism. If the current model is making the rich richer and the poor poorer, I've got views on the banking system in the UK not being sufficiently aligned with the real economy, and there are discussions going on about reforming that so that there is, how should we say, a more equitable share out of the spoils of capitalism. But the idea that it's either capitalism or something else is a false debate. I think, as we saw from Thomas Piketty's book on the history of capitalism, there's been enormous responses about the accumulation of wealth and how it happens, whether it's through land, whether it's through you know, existing models. We can modify the model to be more socially friendly, is all I'm saying. That debate still needs to happen.
Well, as you can see, it's just the beginning of the discussion. Join me in thanking our panel. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Well done.